Hello everyone, it's Kyle Wersinski and I'm going to be doing my Week 5 presentation titled Changes in Public Administration Through the 1970s. So the topics we're going to be discussing are the changes from the early founders' closed systems to open systems, the concept of changing from dual federalism to cooperative federalism, and bureaus and bureaucracies and how they are formed and how the individuals that work within those influence the organization and how the environment influences the organization. So first of all, we want to talk about the early theorists and closed systems, and those were really thought up by Weber, Bernard, and Fayol, and they really had a closed system in which organizations were established by a leader or a political body, and they had set rules to follow, and those rules were derived internally. And then you'll have Frederick Taylor that talks about the one best way to do things due to his research within scientific management. So that worked throughout the early 1900s, and then by 1960s, 1970, Katz and Kahn identified that these closed systems really weren't applicable anymore, and we had open systems which received feedback from their environment and also took inputs from the environment. So you have inputs, you process those, and you provide outputs, and those outputs go back into the environment and serve the public. They also touched on a concept of equifinity, and that was in direct contrast to Taylor's one best way, and that there was multiple good ways at performing actions, and that it wasn't just one way to do something. The next theory that kind of became outdated was the U.S. Constitution's concept of dual federalism, in which there was a distinct separation between the state's authority and the federal government's authority, and the U.S. Constitution was established to, in essence, limit the federal authority and give most of the policing powers to the states. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came along in the 1930s, and we all know about the New Deal and how he started flushing the different states with cash to get things completed. That cash came with some caveats or restrictions, and that the states needed to implement policies set by the federal government. So this concept of cooperative federalism, which is also called marble cake federalism because everything's integrated or intertwined, like the picture shows, it became something that started in the 1930s, and by 1966, Grodzins really thought that, I don't even know what kind of cake he would call it. I mean, we would call it marble cake, but really he felt that almost all the different functions that government produces at the federal, state, or local level are intertwined so much that we really operate as one single system. And he also said that it's very chaotic, but he does understand that it actually works out to the benefit of the entire country to have these things. So lastly is some expansion of the theory by Max Weber in the 20s, and Weber identified that bureaus or bureaucracies were established from a charismatic leader, and by the 1960s and 70s, Downs had identified that yes, that's true, but there's also three other ways that bureaus were being created. One that Weber did not talk about was a split off, and a good example of that is the United States Air Force splitting off from the actual Army after World War II because there was a distinct difference, or the people within that organization that flew thought there was a distinct difference between their services and that be of the Army. The next is creating a bureau out of nothing, and we saw that in response to the tragic events of September 11th, in that President Bush created the Department of Homeland Security. So there was a need, there wasn't any split off, so we just created a bureau to make the country safer. And then lastly, we have an entrepreneurship concept of creating a bureau because there's some public demand for that, and you have people that step up and they have an entrepreneurship mentality, and they can create a system in which to satisfy that public's demand. And the last thing I want to touch on is within these bureaus, they all have similar life cycles, which they grow and they either plateau or they end up perishing or dissolving. But each of these organizations has these individuals that Downs calls climbers, and they're the ones that are very energetic. They want to get into an organization that moves up or grows, and they want to move up the organization, be promoted, and reach the highest level they can. This is somewhat of a contrast between what Weber and Fayol talked about, because they talked about people that would get into an organization and work their entire life there, become an expert, and they would move up. Now, climbers they're interested in doing that, but if they see an organization that plateaus or stops growing or is in trouble, they will quickly jump ship to another one, and that's a contrast that I don't think Fayol and Weber foresaw. They felt like everyone would kind of just stay with the organization no matter what. So my views on the situation is I think all three of the 1960s and 17s theorists that we read this week kind of have a better theory that's more applicable today than the early theorists did, or that the early founding documents did. And I'm not saying that those early ones were wrong by any means, but I just think that as time went on, additional research was compiled and read through, and that these theorists kind of touched on a couple of deficiencies, or just kind of built on the early foundations from the early 1900s. So I think that open systems definitely more applicable even now than in the 1970s. The concept of dual federalism is definitely true and well and alive. Not dual federalism, cooperative federalism is well alive in the country, even though that new federalism kind of started moving forward as well to go ahead and try to limit federal authority. And then I think that there's multiple ways on creating bureaus. There's probably even more at this point in time than the four that Downs identified. But I also agree that we have individuals that jump around between bureaus in order to further their career, as opposed to what the early theorists thought would happen. Here are my references from this presentation and my paper. So thank you so much for watching. I look forward to reading and watching all of your presentations as well. Thank you.